I actually think it's probably the minimum he had to do and the maximum he could do. He was between a rock and a hard place.
Today, I have announced the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, to spend 2.5% of our GDP on defence. But in light of the grave threats that we face, we will bring forward that target so we meet it in 2027.
I'm not so sure that he necessarily needed to give that to the Trump team as part of his preamble to Thursday, but it obviously helps. And I think Pete Hegseth yesterday said it was a good sign from the UK. So anything that sort of maintains a good relation between the US and the UK has got to be a good thing. I don't think it was done just because he was going on Thursday. I think we were going to have to do it. You look at the language coming out of America, the fact that Europe's got to stand up on its own 2 feet. It was inevitable, I think. Can we defend the UK right now? Broadly speaking, yes. From the types of threats that are likely to get close to the UK in the current circumstances, yes, we have the capability to defend ourselves. There are some nagging gaps. We don't have a very sophisticated or extensive air and missile defense system, like a Patriot system that can be used to shoot down missiles, incoming cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. That is quite a large gap for the UK. The good news is we're quite a long way back from our potential foes. A lot of NATO countries are between us and them. So that's something we'll have to look at and manage over time. And I think there will be money spent on that. I think we've already seen some announcements recently, but we'll really have to have a hard think about that. I think taking your question a step further, how are we able to defend NATO is a slightly broader question, because if that is an incursion, let's say in the Baltic states, 1,500 troops in the Baltics is not going to cut that. In fact, we'd have to be extremely quick to be able to intercept any type of Russian incursion there if they chose to do it. And we've seen how they build on borders like Ukraine, saying that they're going to do nothing, and then they do something. So if that type of scenario comes up, how much combat power can we put forward alongside NATO colleagues? And that's where things start to unravel a little bit, because you can do it for a while, and if you do it together, it will be fine. But if you start to have to do that for a prolonged period, 6 months, a year, a couple of years, and if we look at Ukraine, if you look at the timeline from 2014 to today, that's a long period to maintain a defensive posture or a deterrent effect. So I think that's the more critical question. We can defend little old UK in isolation, but can we provide sufficient combat mass to also help NATO defend NATO? And it isn't just about defend. Of course, if we just talk about holding up a shield and batting Russia away for a period of time, that's one thing. But of course, that's a pretty defeatist approach to military combat. You need to strike back in order to deter Russia from doing it in the first place. So having that mass to be able to strike back into Russia immediately, so that they know that they're not going to get away with it, that is perhaps the critical thing. So it's an offense, a credible offense, in order to defend or deter that attack. This is the critical sort of piece that Europe will now need to look at. I'm slightly biased. I happen to think our air capability is pretty good. Within NATO, there's only one other nation that does the breadth of the things we do, and that's America. Now, it does it a lot bigger than we do, but the sort of specialist capabilities that the UK still retains, albeit in very, very small numbers, is something that NATO will really value. Some of our sophisticated surveillance capabilities, our drone capabilities, although they will need to accelerate. Some of those things, our air warfare center, our electronic warfare capability, we've been working alongside America, very, very closely for so many years that we know the secrets. We know how to do this. And that will be highly prized within NATO. I would argue our Navy is probably up around that sort of description as well. But again, very thin. But the capabilities that they have, and this is true probably both of the Navy and the Air Force, are purposely designed to take on an enemy like Russia. They always have been. So when Afghanistan happened, when Iraq happened, we didn't completely change the structure of the Air Force and the Navy to adapt to a counterinsurgency model. So the models that we have within the Navy and the Air Force are actually well suited to a Russian type threat. So there's a good solid foundation well, sorry, a shaky foundation, but a foundation of all the right things on which we can build. So as you throw money at the problem, you are talking about just thickening what you've got rather than a total redesign. I think the army's in a very different space, and I think they are having to sort of recock, if you like, and think about how they now approach that Russian threat. They've been doing it for a while, but decades in Afghanistan and Iraq has understandably shaped them and configured them differently. The good news is the Russian army's a long way away from the UK. So how many UK troops we would need to run forward? You know, the good news is we could do it by train or by road. I mean, that's the great thing about a continental war is it's close. The bad thing is it's close. But so there's a lot there. So all the things that we think about when we look at global projection, so lots of aeroplanes to fly troops all around the world. Well, we can begin to take some risk on some of that because we're talking about a very different war. It's close, it's connected by land largely. And we know that in a war with Russia, some of the capabilities that we've used in counterinsurgency are less effective because they're vulnerable. And therefore, spending more money on those vulnerable platforms, as sophisticated as they are, is not the right answer if you're actually looking to give Russia a bloody nose and make them realize that they'll get a bloody nose. So it might be a little bit more about the more raw, more physical combat power that is more applicable in that type of the deterrent fight. And by moving your troops and everything a lot closer, then range suddenly doesn't become as big a factor as it might if you're trying to support an operation in Asia or elsewhere. So that then becomes the foundation on which you can rebuild or re-emphasize what you need to prioritize. There's quite a lot to fix before we even get to this: recruitment, retention, infrastructure, resilience, stockpiles. There's some basics here that need some money spent on, quite a significant sum of money, before we even get to going out and buying extra equipment or recruiting new people. So there's a lot there to be done just on the basics, and I don't think we should underestimate how much of that 2.5% will be swallowed up by that. Quite a lot will be. So we shouldn't kid ourselves here that there's a jamboree for the MOD and they're suddenly going to go out on a spending spree. I don't think that's true at all. I think we're going to see very little change for now. We might see less cuts than we might have been about to see, so that's a good thing. But what we're not necessarily going to see is huge growth. I think we do need to see reform, so we need to see how we spend that money better, and we do need to think long and hard about what we spend it on. But if you start looking at drone capability, just as an example, that might allow you to shift the way you spend your money. And I'm going to pick some controversial things here, but artillery and mortars have been the means by which armies fight for decades. Drones are now clearly showing that they can do similar types of things cheaper, more effectively. You're not as vulnerable because it's quite hard to find someone operating a drone. It's a little bit easier to find a big gun sat somewhere in a wood. So, maybe there's something we can do there, that rather than throw every penny at more mass on some of the conventional things, we can actually add back things for relatively low outlay that do a similar effect. And I'm going to pick on something here, which is a few people will be throwing darts at me. The Apache is not a cheap helicopter. It's a large expense for the army today. It takes a lot of people to operate in terms of its size, and yet its task is in that battle space that is now so congested and so contested that its survivability will be in question. And actually, you then ask yourself, well, what can it do that a drone can't do? And it's those sorts of questions. And you'll be able to say that to airplanes too. I actually think the Air Force, why would the Air Force want to or need to do close air support? I.e. the role that we used to do in Afghanistan, where we would literally drop bombs, a few yards in front of troops against insurgents. You can do that with a drone. You can do it yourself. You don't need to wait for the Air Force to turn up. So you can then allow the Air Force to prioritize on the deeper, more complex mission, and you can use this new technology to do some of these simpler or nearer tasks where you can really start to get value for money by doing it, for hundreds of dollars, not tens of thousands. So, and I'm not suggesting those necessarily are the choices, but those are the questions we need to ask ourselves, all three services, and say, okay, how can we spend this money differently and better, but get more effect for the same amount of money? That's the key here. More money is not going to solve this. I mean, if you threw an infinitesimal amount of money at the MOD, it might end up getting a little bit better. But actually, this is about changing the mindset and the way you buy things. The critical thing, Rachel, is it's adapting now before the fight. Ukraine have done an amazing job of adapting in contact, but that's not the way you really want it to be. You need to be ready now with all of that, with all the training, with all the thought process, with all the defence industrial capacity already fired up. Let's talk about people first. So roughly, and I'm going to pick some numbers here out of thin air, roughly the Army is 70,000 plus or minus, and the Air Force and the Navy are about 30,000 each. Those are the smallest they have been smaller actually just after the Second World War, but and possibly a few in between the First World War too. But they are the smallest they've been, really in modern history. And because there's an argument that says, oh, well, things have become more technical and there's more data, and therefore you need less people. Actually, you sometimes need more people to do some of the back office things than you do to do the front office things. And I think that's also the challenge, that when you look at those numbers of 70, 30, 30, you think, well, that's not bad. That's 130,000 people. Yeah, well, they're not all going to be on the front line. They're not all going to be in aeroplanes or ships. And I think it's focusing on that teeth to tail ratio that perhaps is the area we need to look at, rather than just the numbers themselves. Because I think every service would probably want another 10 to 20%, if I'm honest, to be comfortable. And then you want to think about your reserves, because that gets you to the start line of the war. And then if there's attrition and losses, and we're talking thousands of losses, not tens or hundreds, where do the next people come from? Are you calling up the reserve? Are you calling up, people from the civilian street and training them back in? And you need people to train new people. So that's why you need that extra mass to absorb that constant feed of people in. Ukraine have been fortunate that we've been helping them do that. If you had to do it on your own with no one to help you do it, that becomes quite difficult. So I would say a 10 to 20% uplift would make you a lot more comfortable, but it doesn't fix the problem. You still need to think about the second year, the third year, and the fourth year in the worst case scenario. So that's the critical piece. A lot of language has been flashed about we're on a war footing. If we were on a war footing, the MOD would be staffed by about 30 people, and everyone else would be getting their combats out and going back onto the front line. And that would be true at High Wycombe, that would be true in Portsmouth, and be true in Aldershot too. You need to think about how many people you want in those rear headquarters and how many people you want in those forward headquarters and on the front line. So I think those ratios need to shift if we're going to genuinely put ourselves on a war footing. The stockpiles that we've got today are a lot smaller than they were, and they're a lot smaller than they need to be for a long attritional fight against Russia. The double whammy is the weapons we have today are highly sophisticated. You cannot build them in 5 minutes. Some of these weapons take a year or more to be used, to be manufactured. The worst thing is there are only so many manufacturers of these weapons out there. And when everyone queues up outside the door of the factory saying, can I have some more, please? You start to move to the back of the queue. And that's the other critical factor. So it isn't just about the size of the stocks, it's the speed at which you could replenish them, even in combat. So we have got a double whammy. We need to build up that stockpile. It is not cheap. I think we do need to be looking at cheaper weapons. I'm afraid, we have been seduced by the sophistication of the weapons that we have today, and they are impressive. But when you're up against an enemy that is just going to keep coming at you, just keep coming, then numbers matter. So we are going to have to think about that. If we're going to look at numbers, the Air Force today is thin across the board. The areas that I would look to tackle first would be some of the enablers. So your tanker fleet, and I'm doing this in the context, by the way, that America isn't there anymore. It's there in the background, but it's not front and center on day one. So we need more air-to-air refueling tankers. Now you can convert your A400s very quickly to be a tanker. Europeans have done it already. So there's a ready, and if you're not having to fly lots of troops around the world, because you can drive there or go on a train, because the war is a lot closer, then you could convert some of those tactical transports into tankers very, very quickly. And we've got, I don't know how many we've got today, 20 plus, something like that. So that would be an easy fix. And our airborne early warnings. So we've got these E7 aircraft, which are a radar in the sky. And basically, we bought, well, we're building 3, but we bought 5 radars. So you could quite quickly get a couple of Boeings off the scrapyard and convert the extra 2. So you could increase that to 5 relatively cheaply. I use that word advisory. It's going to cost a bit of money, but you kind of bought the clever stuff already. You just need an airplane to bolt it onto. But again, training the crews is a critical factor. So those 2 things could be fixed quite quickly. They'd be quite critical, and NATO would be desperate to see that. They really would. The next thing you'd fix, well, you'd fix it at the same time, is our combat power is thin. You've got 5.5 Typhoon frontline squadrons, because half of the squadron is a Qatari joint squadron. And I don't know if Qatar are up for fighting Russia in NATO. And you've got 2 F-35 squadrons. Those are incredibly small numbers when you're not only defending the UK, because a lot of those aircraft will end up being the things that we shoot down missiles with, because we don't have the ground-based missile system yet. So that's why that trade-off will be quite important. So 7.5 squadrons, which is where we are today, is about where it was when I left. So we haven't grown. The aeroplanes are better, but we haven't grown, and I would like to see that up at 10 or 12 squadrons. If you wanted me as a commander of the Air Force to be comfortable, I'd like to see 10 or 12 squadrons, because that gives you the ability to rest. And you can't just throw everyone out into a war and expect them to sit there for years on end. It's just not going to work. And I think people tend to look at the numbers of airplanes. So we've got 100 Typhoons. Oh, 100, that's plenty. Yeah, but you're only going to operate 50 to 60 of those at any one time. Partly because of weapon stocks, fuel, crews, fatigue, attrition, engineering, breakdowns, etc. So looking at pure fleet numbers is a mistake. Looking at squadron numbers is a much more crunchy way of looking at a fighting unit. When you look at Manchester United go on the pitch, you look at the 11 on the pitch, not the fact they've got 50 in the back office. And air forces are not that dissimilar. You can't put everybody out on the pitch, and so numbers are misleading in those circumstances. So those are the areas I'd focus on the most in the immediate term. There's some future stuff we need to do too, but I think those are 3 critical areas. And I don't think we should underestimate the threat at home either. So protection around our airfields, that you are going to see little green men trying to attack airfields in the UK through various nefarious means. So having the ability to protect those, they'll be flying their drones out of the forest next door. So we need the ability to take those on. So we are talking about a total, thickening up here. So I think 3 things need to happen, or 3 things will happen if they do. We've got to reform. I think the current Labour team are right. My only warning bell is that pretty much every other defence team has said that too, and tried through a variety of reviews, processes. I've looked at what they are suggesting. I think it could work if you can change the cultures and genuinely shift the mindset within the MOD. That is not an easy thing to do, but my goodness, there's enough to make them focus now. So if ever there was a time to transform, this is it. So that's got to happen first and foremost, because that will allow us to buy things quicker and cheaper, in theory. So fingers crossed for that. The second thing is buy different things. So yeah, as we talked about with drones, that gives you the opportunity potentially to get more combat effect for less money. So those 2 things alone, even before you throw money at the problem, could shift the dial significantly. So the third thing of, okay, what will more money buy you? My gut feel is that 2.5% is not going to move the dial much, visibly. It will fix some of the fabric of defence that we've let go, and it is the hard yards, it is the housing estate, it is the hangars, it is the dockyards. So we don't know what waste money just building infrastructure that's going to get blown up in a war, but we do need to think long and hard about that basic foundation block. And coming back to recruitment and retention, so we've seen an uplift in pay for the armed forces. That's a good step. But actually, that's what keeps people in. If you're going to ask them to do more things now, harder things, more time away from home, in worse circumstances with greater threat, they're going to question why they do it and for how much. So, you know, those things do need to stay to the forefront. So a lot of the basics that need fixing, and I'll put stockpiles in that too, spares. So all the resilience things that we need to do to stop the hollowing out of what we've got. Because not only are we small, it's a little bit hollow inside that small nut as well. So the 2.5% is largely going to sort the hollowing out. The 3% or the journey to 3% is where you're going to see increase in those larger capital programs, more squadrons, more ships, more troops. So yeah, I think everyone needs to just calm down a little bit. I think the idea that we can play fantasy fleets now is a bit wild, and it sounds terrible. A lot of people say, well, where's my money gone? You know, what have I just got for all this? Why have I got rid of the aid budget, etc.? Well, what you've done is you're filling up the reserve tank that you emptied out over the last 15, 25 years. So yeah, it's not going to be noticeable to the naked eye. To the military, it will be a substantial change. They'll see those store supplies build up. They'll see the time they've got to train in some of the high-end things increase. So and they'll see their home life get better. They'll see their working conditions. So it will thicken up and embolden the military to have some courage and belief in what they're working with. And then we can begin the change of the recruitment cycle. We can begin to bring people in. And if you bring that in over time, over the next 5 years, that will match quite neatly as that equipment begins to arrive, as you put your orders in now for things that will arrive in 4 or 5 years' time. So, and you'll pay for them in 4 or 5 years' time. So there is a sequence here that works. Is that fast enough? Well, only Russia knows the answer to that question. In an ideal world, it would be faster. But we are where we are. And this is the right start.